Hello. Welcome to the podcast on consciousness with Bernard Baars and friends. Open-minded conversations on some new ideas about the scientific study of consciousness and the brain. I'm Nat Geld, this show's producer. We're here today with Bernie Baars, acclaimed author in psychobiology, including his newest book titled On Consciousness, Science and Subjectivity, updated works on global workspace theory. Bernie is the originator of global workspace theory, or GWT, a theory of human cognitive architecture, the cortex, and consciousness, and one of the founders of the modern science of consciousness. Our special guest today is Robert Kozma, professor and director of the Center for Large-Scale Integrated Optimization and Networks, CLION, at the FedEx Institute of Technology, and professor of mathematics in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at the University of Memphis. Robert is editor-in-chief of IEEE Transactions on Systems, Man, and Cybernetics, and past president of INNS, the International Neural Networks Society. Our student interviewer, Ilyan Daskalov, is a cognitive science student at UC Irvine. In this episode, we will focus on our just published paper in the journal Frontiers in Psychology, Consciousness Research, titled Global Workspace Theory, GWT and Prefrontal Cortex, Recent Developments, by Bernard Baars, Robert Kozma, and myself. Hi, Bernie. Hi, Robert. Hi, Ilyan. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi, Nat.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Nat.
Nice to be here.
Yay, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. So, before I hand the talking stick to y'all, I thought I'd introduce the gist of the paper briefly for our listeners, okay? In this work, we provide a brief overview of global workspace theory, GWT, along with recent developments and clarifications of modern neuroscientific evidence. GWT started in the 1980s as a purely psychological theory of conscious cognition and has become a prominent approach in scientific studies of consciousness. Based on today's far more detailed understanding of the brain, GWT is adapted to new waves of evidence. The brain-based version of GWT is called Global Workspace Dynamics, or GWD, precisely because the cortex is viewed as a unified oscillatory machine. GWT, therefore, joins other theories in viewing consciousness as the product of highly integrated and widespread corticothalamic CT activity, following a long trail of evidence. In this paper, we aim to clarify some empirical questions that have been raised and review evidence that the prefrontal and posterior regions support dynamic global workspace functions in agreement with several other authors. Static, gross anatomical divisions are superseded by the dynamical connectome of cortex. That brings us to the wonderful moment where I get to pass the mic over to Ilyan. Hi, Ilyan.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for that lovely and detailed intro. And with that being said, let's begin. So, as Natalie already said, we're going to discuss your, Bernie, Robert, and Natalie's paper, which was just published, and it's titled Global Workspace Theory, GWT, and the Prefrontal Cortex, Recent Developments. And as we go through this paper, we're going to discuss each section. And without further ado, let's begin with the introduction. So, this paper that we're discussing today aims to clarify some empirical questions that have been raised and reviews evidence that the prefrontal and the posterior regions support dynamic global workspace functions, in agreement with several other authors. Now, in their recent paper, Raccah et al., 2021, claimed that the prefrontal cortex is not causally involved in enabling consciousness based on their review of experiments. Bernie, why do you disagree with Raccah et al. On this?
I suppose I disagree because the evidence is contrary to what they claim. And evidence is always the touchstone in science. It doesn't matter what your theory says. What really matters is what the facts are.
In that case, what is the argument about? The brain evidence is now compelling that the prefrontal cortex indeed participates in visual conscious stream, for example. And a lot of excellent evidence has emerged over the years, but what are we arguing about here?
It's a very good question. I think we're arguing about the claim that the prefrontal cortex is a kind of a separate department, separate from the posterior parts, the rearward parts of the cortex. Prefrontal cortex is actually the front of the frontal third of cortex. So if you can imagine holding your hand next to your forehead and being hold your thumb about 2.5 inches, 3 inches from your forefinger, that's about the territory of the frontal lobe. And then prefrontal cortex is actually a subsection of the prefrontal lobe, and it is in the front compartment of the prefrontal lobe. The frontal cortex is amazingly important, and the prefrontal cortex is even more important.
I see. Well, that makes sense to me. At least that's what I've studied in school. Well, let's get into the actual meat of the paper. So this was just the introduction part. Now let's go to the next section, which is titled Global Workspace Theory in the Cortex. And it's the subsection we're currently going to discuss is subtitled Global Workspace Theory, a theory of human cognitive architecture, the cortex, and consciousness, a brief overview. And Bernie, since I know this is your area of expertise, I'll direct this question to you. Can you tell me, what does global workspace theory predict about consciousness?
Well, the global workspace theory that was initially developed in the 1980s, based on earlier theoretical work that's called cognitive architectures. Global workspace theory did a number of things, but the primary empirical prediction was to predict a broadcast for conscious events in the brain, so that the notion was that conscious events would appear in the brain as what more recent scientists have called an ignition. And that was kind of a radical prediction because other people had not believed that. The general belief at that time was that attention is selective, and so therefore attention restricts the input and picks only what you have enough capacity to process. In fact, it turns out, of course, that the brain is much, much, much more capacious and functional than we ever imagined in the early 1980s. And we have learned that with the growth of the web, because computer science has walked hand in hand with cognitive science and psychology for decades. So we keep on learning things from each other. And the notion of a broadcast really is easy to understand in the context of a city metaphor, which is a little bit different from prior metaphors. Metaphors are very useful for learning and teaching and for discussing things. So imagine a radio station or TV station in a city that is able to broadcast selectively from different parts of the city to tell the rest of the city about what is happening in some particular neighborhood. That is a workable metaphor. And of course, in the brain, we're talking about huge groups of neurons that do this work, but we can think about it using the city metaphor.
I like the city metaphor. It gives me much more clarity about the theory itself. Now, as I was reading through the paper, I noticed that you wrote that global workspace theory eventually, as new evidence emerged, changed to global workspace dynamics. But I wasn't really clear on what the differences between the two are. Can you talk about the differences between global workspace theory and global workspace?
Yes, sure. The initial stage of global workspace theory was essentially psychological. And at that time, I just used flow diagrams, which most of you will know about, to describe what I thought was happening. And then, of course, a tremendous amount of verbal description, bringing in the psychological evidence, which even at that time was enormous because we know so much about consciousness. We were just not allowed to talk about it as consciousness in the 1980s. So now we can talk about it as conscious. And particularly sensory perception is a beautiful test bed for exploring consciousness. And it turns out to be the one that we use most of the time for scientific studies. But there are many other aspects of consciousness, of course, including visual imagery, for example. And people in the audience may want to bring up some visual images if they're not driving a car, because driving a car means using your visual consciousness for other purposes. You don't want to do that at the same time. Nevertheless, when you have time, you might want to consider some visual images.
And I see that Robert has something to say about it too.
Yeah, okay, so I don't want to interfere with this logic, but I saw that there is something I could inject at this early stage when Bernie and Ian, you discussed about the role of metaphors and how metaphors are so important. And I think it's very important, and in science we work with metaphors, and I think it's very useful to understand. There is one thing I want to point out, that is the computer-brain metaphor, and this is very useful as well. And one of my heroes, John von Neumann, wrote a book on his deathbed about this, and so I think it's very important. But of course, as any metaphor, we need to understand that it has its limitations and it's not perfect. So with the metaphor, maybe two problems can happen. The one is somebody takes the metaphor literally, unfortunately, then thinks that the computers are brains, and that leads to all this AI destroys the world and so on problem. On the other hand, it's that completely deny that metaphor exists, and then you get to a situation that, okay, basically the brains don't allow rigorous scientific study and in particular consciousness. So we need to have a balance between them. And I wanted to point this out because very recently, actually, I met some papers which denied the role of metaphors in the brain studies and so on. And I think it is almost equally as bad as take them literally. So that was my 2 cents.
That's a good 2 cents. And I have one question about that. I'll add another penny. What is the rationale for the denial?
The rationale for the denial would be that any metaphor, it is incorrect, which is true. So, of course, the brain is not a city, right? So, I mean, how can you say that brain is a city? Are you crazy? Or the other thing, you could say, how can you say the brain explodes? The brain doesn't explode, but okay, and so on and so forth. So if somebody takes it very literally, the metaphor, then it says that it's incorrect. And that is a true statement. But in science, I must say, everything is incorrect. I mean, that is science. You put down your theory, and within that theory you build up, and so on and so forth. But once you go beyond the limits of theory, it is incorrect. But that argument is false because, okay, Bernie probably can tell it much better, also the philosophical aspect, but I think that would deny a rigorous scientific treatment of that object, whatever we talk about.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that metaphors, for thousands of years, of course, people have known that metaphors are very useful for learning and for teaching and for communication. And they've also known that metaphors are, hand waving. There's sort of approximations, so that a metaphor is not an equivalence between what you call it. If you say that the ocean is a metaphor for infinity, well, it is. It's actually quite a wonderful metaphor for infinity, and it's not a mathematically rigorous metaphor for infinity, of course. Nevertheless, the conception of the ocean and the sky and the universe and so on as metaphors for infinity, those are very stimulating metaphors. And it's very important to realize that it's very much like writing poetry, for example. If you ask a person writing poetry, do you really mean this metaphor? Of course, they'll say, no, I don't mean this metaphor. But what they're doing is they're tuning their metaphors to fit whatever the thought is that they're trying to convey. And that's what we do in science also. We use metaphors as tools, as thinking tools. And we keep on tuning them, and we throw away the ones that don't work and try to pick up some new ones that might be better, and so on. And in this particular case, I like the city metaphor right now because it reflects the complexity of the brain. As you say, the brain, or the cortex in particular, is like a city. Well, it has all kinds of neighborhoods, but then what you're really interested in is the traffic flow between the neighborhoods. And that's what we mean by dynamics in contemporary brain science. Dynamics has to do with the flow of information between different parts of the brain. And this is in related answer to Ilyan's question.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that as a student of science, metaphors have always helped me grasp a subject a little better. And obviously, as you both pointed out, metaphors should not be taken literally ever, nor they should be denied, because they give us such a clear way of thinking about a specific subject. And indeed, Bernie, I did want to ask you, since we're talking about dynamical regions in the brain, how do they differ from anatomical regions? I know about, the prefrontal cortex, the insula, the hippocampus, those are all anatomical regions. But what do we mean when we talk about dynamic regions in the brain?
It's a very interesting question. And there is not a really simple answer, but the city metaphor will help us, I believe. What happens in a city when you have an earthquake, which happened in San Francisco maybe 20 years ago, a nice big earthquake. It wasn't nice for the people who fell down the bridge. One of the big, long bridges called the Bay Bridge in San Francisco actually had a concrete section, that's a big, big section of the freeway, that fell down into the San Francisco Bay. Great disaster for the poor people who fell, of course, and for all the cars that had to hit on the brakes and screech to a halt and be diverted, assuming they survived in good shape. So it was a great disaster locally. And one of the interesting things about it is that this tremendous earthquake damage did not interrupt the flow of traffic, even automobile traffic, between the two parts of the Bay Area, which are the city of San Francisco and what is called the peninsula, the San Francisco Peninsula. It did not interrupt the flow of traffic because the traffic was diverted through a different bridge, essentially. Radio was not interrupted. Television was not interrupted. Computer communication was not interrupted because those are all fail-safe systems. And if one of the cables was damaged, for example, as the part of the Bay Bridge fell, the big concrete slab fell, then they would have found a different way to route the same electronic traffic. So this is an aspect of dynamism. And neurologists who treat people with brain damage have realized for 2 centuries, I think at least, that when there is local damage in the cortex, it is very often undetectable in terms of functional impairments that the patient shows. And the most famous examples of this are the split brain surgeries, which are actually done by surgeons deliberately in order to stop the flow of epileptic seizures, electrical storms from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. Surgeons feel, even today, confident enough that the brain will recover if there is selective damage to this bridge that exists between the two hemispheres, called the corpus callosum, or the callus, the hard body. The body that, if you're a surgeon, you can dip your finger down between the two hemispheres, and you can tell there's a part of the brain tissue that you're touching that is harder than the rest. And so that's called calloused, for whatever reasons people decided 5 centuries ago. And it's a body because it's a structure, and you can actually feel it and touch it and see it anatomically with the naked eye. Anatomical gross anatomy like that is fundamentally important in understanding the brain. And then, of course, like a city, looking at the city as if it's an object at a distance is very, very useful. But then you need to see the actual traffic, single automobiles going back and forth, single messages, telephone messages and cell phone messages and this, that, and the other thing, huge amount of information traffic going back and forth in the city. And just like the disaster, the earthquake disaster with the Bay Bridge, when a huge concrete slab of the roadway fell down into the San Francisco Bay, maybe 1,000 feet below. Even when that happened, the traffic flow continued, in some cases continued without interruption, and in other cases, of course, there was some interruption, then it was fixed. And both of those systems, both the city and the brain, have locations, and the locations are really, really important. And they also have dynamics, and the dynamics are beautifully functional. And that means that there's not an arbitrary flow of signals back and forth between point A and point B somewhere in the city. What there is a functional flow of information, so that the particular part of the brain that's knocked out, let's say, very often can be compensated for by another part of the brain that overlaps in function. It may have similar functions, or it may have related functions.
That
so
explains.
There's this fabulous flexibility. Go ahead, Ilyan, please.
I was just going to say that explains why, after all the fallings from trees I had as a kid on my head, I still seem to function rather normal.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, your brain is carefully evolved and designed to survive small strikes by peaches and pears and apples and things.
Well, thank God for biology, I guess. That was a pun intended. So let's just move on to the next session, if we may. In there, specifically, we're talking about the global workspace family of theories, and that is evidence-driven. Gentlemen, can we discuss what are the unifying principles of the global workspace family?
Well, we've just sort of invented the family. I have to tell you, this is a confession. Don't tell anybody else, please. The family is something that has emerged very much. I'm very happy about it. And basically what happened is that way back in the 1980s, I started to talk about this based on prior work. Alan Newell, who was one of the great pioneers in computer science and AI, and Newell himself learned his craft, of course, from even earlier work in what was called the cognitive architecture tradition. So I'm sort of the son of the son of the son of Alan Newell and prior people, very, very good people in psychology and computer science. And what I learned was to use the term and the concept of a global workspace, which was, the term goes back to Newell. Global workspace is a way of looking at what is called the stream of consciousness, which is a very narrow stream, as compared to the enormous parallel storage, memory, unconscious functions, all these things that happen at the same time. This stream of consciousness is serial. The vast unconscious part of the brain functions in parallel whenever it can. And that's a realization that goes back to the 1980s. And what Newell recognized very beautifully is that you can imagine the narrow stream of consciousness as a result of loads of little agents in the enormous unconscious domain of the brain, arguing together, playing together, competing and cooperating competing against each other and cooperating with each other in order to enable the serial stream. So when you have a thought or a visual image comes to mind, or you say something to yourself in inner speech, which is a really important modality of consciousness, when you do that, it is quite possible that this is actually kind of a conspiracy by all kinds of unconscious little robots. I shouldn't say robots because the brain is emphatically not a robot, but they're little agents that are creating your conscious experience at any given moment. And that occurs on a rate of about 10 hertz, 10 cycles per second. So let's say about 10 squeaks that go from the little agents in the audience to playing their part on stage.
All right. Well, this one will be directed at Robert. So, can you tell me what are the unifying principles of the global workspace family, please?
Okay, so my answer is no. Probably I cannot tell you all the unifying principles, but I can volunteer to tell some of those. Just a few bullet points, some mental marks, and then I just drop the ball to Bernie. So I think the ignition is a very important thing. It relates to the thought that something is continual, but not necessarily continuous. So there are some periodicity, and that could be about the 10 hertz. So it's roughly speaking, it's a quasi-periodic. So that is experimentally observable. That's an important part of the family. So that's this ignition and discrete. So the unity of discreteness and continuity. Then the other related concept is the unity of the localization most of the time, and then Bernie mentioned the agents and so on. It's more localized, but when it gets to the consciousness, then it's very rapidly a large-scale synchrony evolves, and that is also measurable and relates to the broadcast and different interpretation. So that's the local and the large-scale, and there is maybe the intermittent large-scale synchrony. And of course, so when we talk about the theta, that's more like not theta, the 10 hertz or around 10 hertz. So that is alpha, but theta, we now call it the theta alpha. And then that is the kind of underlying periodicity. But we know that the content is carried in the beta gamma. So that's the higher. So there is if you just properly continue with these frequencies, the magic number, I think 5 or 6 plus minus 2 comes up, the ratio of these cycles and so on and so forth. So that is my initial thought of this.
Yeah, let me go back to Ilian's question, please, because Robert just described it. Let me put it back in terms of Ilian's question. What are the unifying principles of the GW family? I think the major take-home lesson is quite simple. We tended, historically in psychology, we tended to think about consciousness as a squeezing of the bandwidth of information because of selective attention. That means selecting just one stream of information out of 100 different streams that you could select at any given time. And that is true in its own way, of course. But the claim here is that when you select one stream out of 100, that what happens inside of the cortex particularly is that you get an ignition, so that the information from that particular conscious stream spreads as soon as it becomes conscious. And that has now been beautifully verified by a great deal of quite remarkable brain science. So I think the unifying principle, I suppose the first unifying principle of the global workspace family is that idea that there is a kind of a broadcast of conscious contents as soon as they become conscious in the visual cortex, for example. We observe that ignition or broadcast, those are essentially identical terms as far as we are concerned.
Let's go to the next section of the paper titled Global Workspace Theory and the Corticothalamic System. So as I was reading through a paper, it became clear that the cortex and the thalamus it seems like they both play a very essential role in consciousness. Now, Robert, would you tell me what role did the prefrontal and the posterior regions of the cortex play in dynamical workspace functions?
Let's start in a broader context. So in the case of thalamo-cortical interaction, I think that's very important. The way I see, and that really based on my decades-long collaboration with Walter Freeman and from Berkeley, a neuroscientist, on a lot of experimental evidence is that the cortical sheath is really a unified oscillatory organ. So the thalamus is projecting from deeper brain areas, and then there is a corticothalamic loop, which is important here. So I think that's one I wanted to mention. Now, as far as the prefrontal and posterior, so the different sensory areas, I would say just following this ignition idea and then broadcast. So the ignition probably could happen in any of the, could be a visual or other sensory areas, whatever are important, and then they very rapidly propagate to ultimately cover the whole brain, and then the prefrontal, and then the conscious. When it's needed, the decision is made, and then once it's made, then this large-scale synchrony collapses, and this whole cycle starts again, including the thalamocortical loop. So that is in broad lines. I don't know if I answered at least partly your question.
I think that was very clear and segues us very well into our next question, which I want to direct to Bernie. Since you mentioned a couple of times binding and broadcasting in the brain, can we talk about what exactly is binding and broadcasting?
Yeah. At this moment, the consciousness of our listeners combines all kinds of information into a single conscious percept. We can call it a percept, that's a useful word from perception, or we can call it a conscious gestalt, which is even a better word from the gestalt movement in psychology that emerged around 1900 and taught us so much about vision, for example. A gestalt is a whole. It's a conscious whole. And the audience right now, if the audience is listening to a single word, for example, they will be binding all the different sources of information to come up with that word as a single entity. For young children who don't have language yet, the sound of the word is not a single entity. It is, who knows exactly what it is. It's probably a fuzzy, cloudy thing. But I'm guessing, of course, because we don't know what babies are thinking. But that's a reasonable guess. For all the people we've been able to study, of course, that is routine. We start to learn something, and we're typically quite confused at the beginning of the learning process because we don't know what goes with what. And then after a while, we figure out, yes, A goes with C, and B goes with D, and so on. And so suddenly the gestalt, the unity, the whole percept emerges in consciousness. Very, very important fundamental idea. And we have sadly neglected the Gestalt tradition, but we should not. We need to go back to it and start thinking that way. So what we have is binding, so that different syllables from a multisyllabic word, for example, are glued together in the cortex. The melody of my voice is also helps to shape the glue that holds the syllables together. There are individual phonemes that can be teased out of the acoustical signal. Those are also part of this gestalt emergence that when we hear the words multisyllabic, for example, and so on. And most of us, I think I tend to visualize the spelling of a word because I'm a reader, right? So I tend to visualize things in terms of written words. And that's also part of the Gestalt. And what I've started to realize, as many, many poets have realized for thousands of years, is that even a single Gestalt, even a single conscious event, has multiple levels and dimensions, so that there's a little bit of a body feel to, if you imagine playing tennis, for example, there might be a lot of vision, there might be some body feels, there might be some muscle commands that go out at the same time as you're kind of inwardly playing tennis. And the same thing happens with other conscious events.
I see. Let's move on to our next section of the paper. That section will be titled Global Workspace Theory and the Cortico-Thalamic System. I have a specific question that we got into earlier just briefly, but now we're going to go into more detail. Can you tell me, what did Raccah et al. In their paper written this year, 2021, what did they get wrong about global workspace theory?
Oh, everything. The interesting thing about them is that they apparently looked at the brain as if all the neighborhoods are separate from each other. And that's indeed how the brain looks, because you can see the frontal cortex, and part of that, the frontal part of that, is the prefrontal cortex. And before that, you get parietal cortex and then occipital cortex, all that stuff, right? So they look different to the naked eye, and that's gross anatomy in medical school. That's what it's called, gross anatomy, because you can see it with the naked eye. Well, of course, we know that the real action of the brain takes place at a nano level, a really tiny microscopic level in cells and connections between cells. And those are typically very, very small. And so the information flow in the brain is dynamic and it's functional in pretty much the way that I described before. Functional meaning that it's not just that the information is being tossed around in the brain in some kind of random fashion, but that it's a kind of a purposeful dynamic system, right? Because the brain is biological. Biology is all about survival and reproductive fitness. And in order to obtain reproductive fitness, you have to find your mate and have children. And that's at least what the biology tells us, although we might have different opinions ourselves. Everything about biology has to do with function. And we want to be careful to describe function not in terms of conscious goals, because biology doesn't evolve consciously, but single animals are certainly conscious about their goals at any given time. And that drives their activities, their bodily activities, their conscious perceptions, their bodily feelings, all those things. So we can apply the notion of a goal at the level of single animals. So what did Raccah et al. Get wrong about GWT? Well, I think they misinterpreted the neighborhoods of the brain as functional units. And that is true in a very broad way. So you can say that one part of the city is the financial district, for example, and another part of the city is the train yard, and another part of the city is the urban areas where people go home to live at the end of the day. And those are all functionally somewhat different areas. But the fact is that real functions are carried out on the smaller level by individuals driving their cars or truck drivers driving their trucks and so on. And so that's the functional level where the brain works, as opposed to its mere physical existence. That I think is their major error, that they separated parts of the city that look separate, because the prefrontal cortex, you can easily pull out the prefrontal cortex if you have a dead brain. If you have a living brain, it is not a good idea to do that, because the prefrontal cortex is in constant interaction, functional interaction with the rest of the brain. And that, I think, is the point that we derived ultimately from wonderful evidence that neuroscientists had gathered about the role of conscious vision, for example, which is in part controlled by prefrontal cortex. And that is the wonderful empirical discovery that has come out. And we made use of that, of course, to make our point.
Wonderful, Bernie. Thank you so much for that answer. Robert, I want to hear from you as well on the same question. What do you think Raccah et al. Got wrong about global workspace theory?
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think Bernie said it very well, but I have some additional perspective. So in their experiments, they kind of stimulated different brain areas, and then when they stimulate the prefrontal cortex, they claim there is no detectable change of consciousness, so it is not impacted. But I think this is just they got absolutely wrong. The fact that by poking into or shocking the frontal cortex doesn't produce something what they would consider as conscious fact, it doesn't mean it is not impacted. It just means that, okay, probably you didn't shook enough. I mean, I don't tell them to shook more, but in fact, I wouldn't shook at all. But the point is that the fact that they did something and it didn't produce an effect, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So that is my maybe what I wanted to add here.
Yeah, Robert already knows, obviously, that the prefrontal cortex is enormous. It's unbelievably complicated. There are many, many local areas. There are many, many long connections that run from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. So it's a huge city center in its own way. And so if you stimulate just one person living in the center of the city, with an electrode, a tiny, tiny electrode that puts in a little bit of juice in one particular cell, let's say, or maybe a small group of cells, you cannot really claim that you have disproven some hypothesis about what other little groups of people might be doing in that particular part of the brain. There is actually very beautiful evidence from other neuroscientific teams who have discovered that the prefrontal cortex is necessary for conscious vision, even though conscious vision is directly served by the back of the brain, the occipital cortex, which is mostly visual processing. Vision is really, really important for human beings, of course, because we're primates and we have binocular vision, we have very good color vision, and so on. We're very much dependent on our conscious vision. And so it's really important to realize that what is conscious at any given moment, even in vision, which relies on the back of the brain, is that the prefrontal cortex is still wired to conscious vision. That is kind of, it seemed like a superficial contradiction, but it turns out to be true, and there's direct evidence to that effect, so that the claim that selective stimulation in the prefrontal cortex in small numbers of cells or patches of cells, that does not involve consciousness, is in fact contradicted by some of the research that was cited by Raccah et al. So the evidence is just very much against that claim that prefrontal cortex is doing nothing for visual consciousness.
Well, that was a very extensive and in-depth answer. Thank you, Bernie. That, to me, it does sound like the prefrontal cortex has got to be involved in consciousness. I just don't see how it's not, to be honest. And even from just simply evolutionary perspective, as we go from a simple animal to a more complex animal, we like to think that the more complex animals are the ones that are conscious as compared to, let's say, a worm. And as far as I know, but a worm doesn't have a huge prefrontal cortex. I don't even know if it has a prefrontal cortex. So that just makes it clear to me that it just has to be involved. And this leads us perfectly into the next section of the paper, actually. And Robert, I know this is your field of studies, so my questions here will be directed to you. However, I just wanted to read a little part of the paper just to introduce our listeners to your theory, and that is called cortical neuropercolation theory. So in the paper, you say that mathematically, the dynamics of local global effects have been described as neuropercolation theory. Neuropercolation describes cortical phase transitions in the neuropil, or layer 1. These phase transitions take place between a basal state consisting of competing, local, fragmented components and a state of high coherence across the hemisphere globally when the roles of space and spatial differences cease. The transition from fragmented states to global coherence appears to be ignited in areas IT, MTL, in the case of visual consciousness, something that Bernie spoke about earlier. So My question to you, Robert, is as I was reading the paper, I'm a simple-minded human being. Can you explain to me what neuropercolation theory is for the non-mathematical mind?
Yes. All right. Okay. Let's see. We have neuropercolation theory to describe the complex spatial temporal dynamics in the brain. So before moving to neuropercolation, let me say a few words about percolation theory. And that is in physical non-living systems. So percolation is when you have a porous material and then some liquid or some substance protrudes through these pores and then propagates in that material.
It's a coffee metaphor, right, Robert?
Yeah, I think it's a coffee metaphor because the percolation, in some parts of the world, they call it percolators, the coffee machines, and that you put in around coffee and then maybe high pressure. In Italian espresso, very high pressure. In American style, it's kind of just hot water basically flows through, but nevertheless percolates through this and then produces the coffee what we drink. And of course, coffee is very important. Actually, just let me say that even in the mathematics, Paul Erdős, who is in graph theory, and I will mention him in a moment for the percolation, but just let's say for the time being for the coffee, he was an avid coffee drinker, and he actually, the Erdős, when we talk about the Erdős number, so if you wrote with Erdős, then you have Erdős number 1 and 2 and 3, and basically this leads to this small world phenomena, but we talk that it's about the diameter, or the longest is maybe 6, 7 or so. So that is the Erdős. So Erdős used to say, as a mathematician and avid coffee drinker, that, okay, mathematicians are really just an automata. They drink a lot of coffee and convert into mathematical theorems. So that's that's what, and he was very good at that. And I think that just gives you a kind of metaphor. So that's what's going on. So that is the percolation when something propagates through. Now the brain, when we look about neuropercolation, then we look at the brain as a big network. And of course, brain and networks for the last 20 years, it's exploded and it's very popular and very productive research. Now, what neuropercolation is specific about, it's really the concept of phase transition. And maybe one way to put it, that when we just discussed previously about the ignition, that, okay, there is some ignition, the broadcast in some part of the brain and rapidly propagate. So that mathematically you could say, okay, before the ignition, the different parts are kind of not very coherent and have the autonomy. But at the moment of ignition, then suddenly a very rapid synchronization happens. And that is what that neuropercolation can describe. Very, very rigorous mathematical tools. Maybe I just mentioned 3 points. One is that, as opposed to the standard percolation model, when you just think about the coffee machine, once the water started to propagate from top to bottom and produces the liquid, once it's wet, it remains wet. The standard percolation is the one-way process. When we use this in the case of brains, then we allow that, okay, even though something was wet at the moment or active, later on it can become inactive. So that's one important. There is some random component, but maybe one very, very important thing that I want to point out, and that is neuropercolation and the neuropil about it, the role of non-local connections. I mean, that is what we observe in any neural tissue, right? So any neuron have several thousand connections in the direct arbor of the somatic arbor, but then you have a long axon. And obviously there is a reason, there must be a reason there is a long axon, right? Because all the neurons have that. But I want to point out that is very, very, very peculiar to the nervous system, and in other physical processes you don't have that. So in the neuropercolation model, we describe this combination of a more regular local structure and this very sparse but nevertheless absolutely crucial non-local projection, and that is what can produce now in our model that synchronization, desynchronization transitions very nicely what we observe as a manifestation of also conscious processing.
Are there any types of neurons that you are able to actually differentiate? I read a paper recently that was talking about pyramidal neurons, this long distance reach, and I wondered if there were particular neurons that you were able to discern from your research, Robert, with regards to what you just described.
Okay, all right. When it gets to the neuroscience, so I'm relying more on Bernie's help, but I would think that even if you look at the local region, maybe you can call it a column or some microcolumn, maybe hundreds of thousands of neurons or whatever. So even within that, it is very important that you have the long connections in addition to the local one. So that is one level. I think it's very important. We have a hierarchy of these models, starting from something with these local populations but then in the next level, and the intracortical connection between brain areas, that's another level of non-locality, and that's also very important. So I think that both are important. And okay, Bernie, what you want to add?
Yeah, this is really very profound, and so it's not all that easy to understand right away. The empirical background of this was built by Walter Freeman, the late Walter Freeman, who was a very great neuroscientist, in collaboration with Robert. And so that was a very powerful combination of scientific brains. And Walter discovered quite beautifully that there are phenomena in the brain that are totally different from the way we usually think about the brain. We usually think in terms of neurons that are sort of clicky little things, and they fire and they send a little signal down along axons. And that is true as far as it goes. But then you have all kinds of combinations of neurons, including excitatory ones, inhibitory ones, long ones, short ones, tufty ones, straight ones, and so on. There's huge variability among neurons, which is a very important fundamental point. So Walter and Robert, in terms of the analytical work, discovered that in the top layer of cortex, called layer 1, there is something happening that is totally different from what we had imagined prior to that, and that is an all or none process. It's a phase change process that occurs about 10 times per second, and any single phase equilibrium, if that's the correct word, tell me if I'm wrong, Robert, phase equilibrium emerges for about a little less than 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and then collapses. So during the phase, there's self-organization in layer 1 of cortex, and during the collapse, there is disorganization. Disorganization is just as important as self-organization, because self-organization freezes the information, and disorganization opens the system up to new information. So new perturbations of the cortex can come in during that critical 5 or 10 milliseconds between the self-organization. And I think this is what Robert refers to in terms of this concept of phase changes. And the easiest metaphor for a phase change is melting water or freezing water, which is actually a profoundly interesting phenomenon from a physics point of view. And the theoretical apparatus for what Robert is doing emerged, at least in part, from a deeper understanding of nonlinear phase changes in water and similar media.
Yeah, and that's yet another example. But at the beginning, we discussed about the role of metaphors, right? So Bernie just told a metaphor, and somebody rightly could say that, okay, are you crazy? It's nothing melting in my brain. I think, I hope not. And or freezes or condensing or whatever. Yes, that's true. But what is the phase transition? But it does take place, the highly organized dynamical state, which could be, more related, like keep the water and the steam evaporation boundary. So the water is more organized, has some degree of freedom, but when it evaporates, then you get a more random behavior and dynamics. So that's what we are talking about. I think here is a very important issue that, of course, graph theory and network theory are broadly used in brains, connectome and all. So it is there. But what I think neuropercolation adds to this is the very important role that the brain tunes at the edge of critical behavior. And that relates to some connectivity and dynamic properties. If we are not looking at very carefully, it's very easy to just don't notice, and then maybe the experiment is just follows some superficial features. So what we now identified that the brain has developed, and that both development evolutionary for millions of years, but then also when a child born, and then first there are relatively sparse connectivity and becomes more and more, and now at the age of maybe half a year or below 1 year, that's a certain critical connectivity structure reached, and then which allows some cognitive functions. So that evolution puts the brain at the edge that it can be easily converted from more organized and less organized state. Now, maybe just one more thing to add. I think these long axons and non-local connectivity is really, really very important, because as we discussed, that if it would be just the direct neighbors coupling and so on, then it would be something like a physical process, physical in the sense that, okay, melting of the ice or evaporating the water. So that why would it oscillate? So the oscillation is really, now we have a mathematical form to describe, and the evidence is due to these non-local propagations. In a nutshell, that when you project to a large distance, instead of just need to go step by step, so the synchronization, it's very rapidly grows, but it shuts itself down in 100 milliseconds or so. So it's again could happen, and that is the mechanism that is very delicately built up in the brain, and that ultimately can get this higher cognitive function.
Fascinating stuff, and thank you so much for those detailed answers, gentlemen. If you don't mind, let's move on to the next section of the paper, which is titled Conscious Events Go Beyond the Senses. Bernie, what does global workspace theory or global workspace dynamics have to say about the role of the local regions?
In the history of neuroscience, there is a constant debate between localization and global functions. And that division, that kind of tension between two different points of view, is still around today. And it's important. Most neuroscientists right now are interested in smaller and smaller and smaller, because there's so much wonderful information that appears when you look at single cells, or when you look at single neurotransmitters, for example. Very, very important. And then there are those things that involve the brain as a whole. And the most famous ones, perhaps, are the cases of neurological damage, where in fact you get recovery of function even though you're missing half your brain, which actually can occur in children, particularly because children have a very great capacity for recovery of function, even with considerable damage on, let's say, in one hemisphere. Later on in life, we become less adaptive, but still the cortex functions as a whole. And that is really what we're trying to understand. What Walter and Robert demonstrated very beautifully is that you have clicks. Cinematic is the word that was used. Cinematic clicks, almost like an old-fashioned projector projecting the movie onto a screen, or an old-fashioned video camera that records one click at a time, one brief event at a time, and then you go to the next one, about 100 milliseconds separate from each other. So that's in the same rough time domain. And this is actually visible now at the level of the brain if you do the right kind of analysis. And that's the work that Walter Freeman and Robert Kozma have worked out so beautifully.
Thank you for that answer, Bernie. And that leads us actually to one of the most meaty parts of the paper. So I'd like to discuss this in depth if you don't mind. That specific section is titled Metacognition, using the prefrontal cortex to think about thinking. Let's start with something simple. Robert, what is metacognition?
Okay, so the way I see that metacognition is when you can step out of the box. Let's put in that way, and you look at yourself from outside and thought processing. That we humans have this capability from time to time if we try, and I think that is very important. So we can look at ourselves also from an eye of outsider. Okay, so why and how this is possible, and there are a lot of potential theories for that, starting with that, okay, cognition. If that cognition is a positive thing or metacognition, or a negative, in a sense that do you create something when you do the cognitive processing, or just the other way around, that is always there, and when you get a higher understanding, you just remove the garbage or the unnecessary things, and then the truth shines out. So I think this is the underlying question here, and as always, I think that truly understand metacognition, you need to have both sides. So, and I just would mention the work of Scott Kelso. He follows that tradition, Prigozhin and Raccah and Kelso on this. Instead of looking at the opposite tendencies as enemies, try to merge them together. So I think that the metacognition is a manifestation for that. Okay, sorry, that's what I said.
No, that was a wonderful, wonderful answer. So thank you, Robert. Bernie, this question will be directed to you. So as I was reading through the paper, I noticed that you classify two types of metacognition, conscious and unconscious. Can you tell me what are the fundamental distinctions between conscious and unconscious metacognition?
Yeah, they're fairly straightforward. And for some reason, because we have lost such important science during the long period of behaviorism when you were not allowed to talk about consciousness, we kind of have to recover the obvious. Conscious metacognition is consciously thinking about conscious thinking. So if you were thinking about the Pythagorean theorem, as I'm sure most of our audience was thinking about this morning when they were getting up out of bed, then you can say, well, I think the Pythagorean theorem, if you projected it to 10 dimensions, implies thus and such. But Robert was thinking about that this morning. I was not, I assure you, thinking about that. But maybe if the thought came to mind, I would have some conscious thoughts about it, like, I can't possibly solve this problem in my head, go away, which is probably what I would have thought consciously about that. But there's also all kinds of unconscious associations and metacognitive things, emotional things, shame and pride, actually both, are metacognitive emotions, because shame says, if you're 3 years old, and your sister calls you a poopy kid, and you sink into the earth with shame and remorse and terror, and you feel like you're falling apart, that's metacognition, because you are conscious of something you were conscious of before, namely being called a poopy kid. So,
were you called a poopy kid by your sister when you were a kid?
I think I must have been, because it keeps on coming up for me. And I think it's a post-traumatic thing, Gotta be.
Suppressed trauma.
Yeah, suppressed trauma. But it's not just actually post-traumatic for me, because the experience of shame that emerges, and pride, that emerges around age 3 is apparently epigenetically controlled by this extraordinary life development control course that we have, which sometimes emerges in very predictable ways. And apparently the shame and pride emotions emerge around age 3 or 4, maybe 5, whatever, for children in a very predictable way. And it's devastating. You think you're happy, you think you're wonderful, you celebrate yourself, you run around naked and screaming because you think you're so terrific. And then suddenly somebody, I will not mention the person, says, "Oh, you're just a poopy kid." And you crash, totally embarrassment, sink into the earth. So self-conscious emotions are really, really important. And they are metacognitive. Let me just say that.
That leads us perfectly to my next question, actually, Bernie, which is, can those two states, unconscious metacognition and conscious metacognition, exist together?
Yes, no question about it. The rule of thumb is that anytime you have something conscious going on, it is simply preceded, followed, surrounded by a swarm of unconscious things. And we can show that in the case of language, which has been worked out very nicely, where you have sentences, for example, that you hear and there's a whole bunch of processes going on that pick out the grammar and phonemes and the pronunciation and the reply that you're going to give to the person who told you that as soon as you can think of a fast answer and so on. All those things are bubbling up unconsciously long before they emerge in consciousness. And of course, most of them never actually emerge. And we know that pretty much from many sources of evidence that happens.
Thank you for the answer, Bernie. And that actually leads us to the final segment of the paper, which is the conclusion, and that is titled The Dynamical Connectome of Cortex. Robert, I have a question for you. Why does a dynamical view of the corticothalamic core give us a pause about proposing dichotomies that may not be in evidence?
Okay, so I think that very nicely winds back to the starting thought that the brain is unified, certainly the cortex, the unified oscillatory entity, not machine. As far as the dynamics, so maybe because we talk about really two aspects, that's the anatomical connectivity and the dynamic connectivity. And maybe I think the following side may be useful, at least to understand what I think it's important. So we discussed about that it's very important the role of ignition, and then that means that the stream is interrupted, cinematic or frames or whatever. So that is one thing. So there is some temporal chunking and so on. So what is very important to realize, because the brain is so tightly linked and connected, so this temporal chunking inevitably relates to spatial. There is a spatial temporal dynamic. So when you have the time periods, then you get some corresponding spatially localized amplitude patterns, and afterwards when you get large-scale synchronization, basically as it goes to infinity, then the time collapses, there is a singularity, and that's what is happening. So that's why if that question relates to the autonomies of the operation. So you both have continuous, discontinuous, and that's what you learn in this particular case, this machinery of the cortical autonomic core, that you cannot just look at one part. And if in order to understand this very advanced concept for consciousness, you just cannot get by simplifying to extremes. So you need to merge them.
Bernie, is there something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, the temptation. Human beings seem to like dichotomies. So we have the sky and the earth, we have male and female, we have all kinds of dichotomies, which are true to a point, but not entirely true. And that bedevils us in the sciences very often, because the tendency at the beginning of trying to understand some new domain is to say, well, there's this part and that part. There's two of them. That's a kind of a cognitive strategy to simplify things. And people do that with the brain. So we talk about the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and that's sort of true. And we're talking about the front and the rear, and that's certainly sort of true. And we talk about the prefrontal cortex and whatever is posterior to the prefrontal cortex, and that is also somewhat true. But it is a gross anatomical division. It really appears beautifully, by the way, when you dissect a brain, for example, which is why it's so important. The dichotomies are real, but they don't tell the whole story. So the really important thing is to dig underneath the dichotomies and look at the traffic flow in the city. It's not just this neighborhood and that neighborhood, although that's true also, but it is the enormous amount of traffic flow. And so the Connectome is a new wonderful discovery showing essentially the street map of the cortex and the larger brain, but mostly cortex. And then we have the traffic flow that goes over the street map. And of course, functionally, it's the traffic flow that matters, because the traffic flow is the signaling that takes place between your senses and your muscular control and your thinking and all those other functions. And that's really what the term dynamic very often means, that things are more flexible, more functional, more less predictable, really, less easily predictable than you think they are.
And once again, metaphors are super useful, as in this case. And what you just said brought us pretty much a full circle to our beginning of the conversation. I have a few more questions, so just bear with me, gentlemen. My next question will be directed at Bernie. Can you tell me what is the most recent theory that was added to the global workspace family?
Sure. There's any number of interesting theoretical proposals by interesting people that use the global workspace metaphor, which the easy way to think about that is in terms of a theater where everything on the stage can be lit up, and everything outside of the stage, either backstage or in the audience, is in the dark and is unconscious. And that turns out to be, although it's very simple and very ancient, that turns out to be a very useful way of thinking about consciousness. And then, of course, I started this in the 1980s, borrowed the word global workspace from Alan Newell, and then started to develop how this may reveal things about consciousness that we had ignored before that. And that worked reasonably well. And then a bunch of other people got interested and naturally started to spin off their own ideas. And this became very, very interesting, very important. So scientific groups started to do research on the brain with those concepts. And mathematicians also started to spin off extremely interesting and important ideas. And so the latest member of the family, I haven't yet asked them if they want to be members of the family, but let's say they're shotgun wedding members of the family. And let's assume that they're willing to be members of the family. We can adopt them. And so the most fun thing that I know right now is a wonderful paper by Gustavo Deco from a very interesting theoretical group that works on these questions. And basically, Deco and his co-authors have taken the connectome, which is the street map of the cortex. And they have developed an idea that says, okay, here is a global workspace function in the connectome, which is this enormous network. And basically, the very beautiful metaphor that they use is called the rich club. The rich club is basically all the rich people in the village who know each other, and they talk to each other mostly about money and about prestige and about my latest Cadillac or Tesla car or whatever. They show off to each other. They play tennis. They talk about things and so on. That's the rich club. And then the Deco group talks about a functional rich club, which is very important because that's the part that does things. It's not just the connections that matter. It is the connections that you give a stock market tip to your good friend in exchange for a pair of golfing clubs or whatever. You have a friendship, you have a trading relationship, you do each other favors, that kind of thing. Those are called FRICs, F-R-I-C-S, little s. Functional rich clubs. And functional rich clubs in the connectome of the cortex, the street map of the cortex, are the centers of interactivity, where the trucks go to deliver things and to carry things away. They are the traffic hubs, if you will. And that can be defined today, given the extraordinarily beautiful map of the cortex that we now have called the connectome. But this is, of course, not just the street map. This is the traffic flow over the street maps. And FRICs look like they're really, really interesting, and they may well function as global workspaces.
How fascinating. I'm curious to see where all that research leads us to. And speaking of leading to something, this leads us to our last topic of discussion. Gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that the cortex is an extraordinarily flexible and dynamic recruitment of different regions for different tasks, as both of you have pointed out in this conversation. Therefore, I feel like an arbitrary division between prefrontal and other neuronal regions tends to be misleading. It seems like consciousness requires a much more broader and more integrative view. What do you think? Robert, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. So, of course, that is prefrontal cortex. It exists. You cannot deny the existence and so on. But when you are talking about complex processes, in particular the consciousness, it just limiting the attention for one area, or for that matter, excluding some area, large brain area from that, it is misleading, and it's really, we should see a unity across this area. So that is absolutely a necessity. Yes.
Bunny, any final thoughts that you want to share with us?
I think that summarizes it very well. You know, the cortex, I think, is the leading edge of life adaptation. And I believe that the cortex begins to function probably in the third trimester of gestation, relatively early. And it's common these days to talk about the dreaming brain as if fetuses are dreaming, and that is probably correct. But dreaming is a conscious state. So the cortex is working away, actually, during the third trimester, roughly speaking. It's different from different babies, of course. And then it begins to learn and learn and learn and learn. And the leading edge of that learning is whatever we are conscious of in any given moment. That's the surf wave that is pushing along and dealing with problems and new things. And the kind of, if you look at young babies, they're just delighted to be looking at the world. They have a little smile on their faces and their eyes are big and shiny. And during those times, they're really taking in information. That is a meaningful facial expression. And the key thing there is that function drives the workings of the brain. So that in early childhood and later childhood, for that matter, learning, curiosity, exploration, realization, problem solving, all those things are so highly functional. Maybe later on in life, it becomes more functional to do drudgery let's say, that's boring stuff, which is hard to do. So it requires some conscious effort. But learning is a much more fun thing to do. And that's what we spend maybe the first 10 years of our lives doing. That's really, really important. Function drives whatever the brain is doing.
And I like that for our ending.
Anyone have any other additional thoughts, Robert, Bernie, or Ilian, to add before we say adieu to our listeners?
Okay, one thing I can add, that we just published this paper, what we discussed, but let me just say that we just came out a follow-up article just about to finish that in another frontiers in system neuroscience, and that more some technical aspect. It's entitled Evolutionary Advantages of Stimulus-Driven EEG Phase Transition in the Upper Cortical Layers. The same three authors, I think it will come very soon. So those who find that paper that we discussed today interesting, then they can look into this next one for some additional details.
That's an excellent point, and I'll include the link to the paper that you just described, and as well as the link to this paper and the figure that we were discussing earlier in regards to ignitions and binding and broadcasting and gestalts. All of that will be included in our show notes and the website and other places like that. And I just want to thank all of you so very much for your thoughtfulness and for your intelligence and focus. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for letting me interview on this wonderful paper. It was a true pleasure being part of this conversation.
To show our appreciation, we are offering our listeners a 50% discount for any edition of Bernie's book on consciousness, science, and subjectivity, updated works on global workspace theory. Just go to shop.thenautilus.com, spelled shop.thenautilus.com, and be sure to enter the word books, BOOKS, in the coupon code box during checkout for that extra 50% savings. Of course, Bernie's books are available everywhere books are sold, although your 50% discount is only available in the Nautilus shop. If you'd like to discover more about the conscious brain and learn more about global workspace functions, please visit Bernie's new website at bernardbaars.com. And I'm going to spell that also, BERNARDBAARS.com. And thank you for listening.